I bet you know the old optical illusion that goes like this. Somebody holds up a piece of paper with an image that looks like this and says, "Tell me what you see. What is it?" And some people will say, "Well, I see a duck very clearly. This is a duck." And of course, they will point to, you got the eye over there, you got the bill over here. This is the head of a duck. And other people will say, "No, what you've got there is a rabbit. Very clearly, that's a rabbit. That's not a duck's bill. Those are the ears of the rabbit, and the eye is still an eye, but the nose is down here, and the ears are up there." And it's funny how even if you've seen this done before, once your brain has decided you're going to see it one way, "Oh, no, that's definitely a rabbit," or slightly turn it, "Oh, that's definitely a duck," it's hard to make your brain change what it sees and realize it could be the other thing. Once your brain has decided, "No, I see this as a rabbit," it's hard unless you turn the page or really make yourself sort of unsee the other image. It's hard to see rabbit could be a duck, could be a rabbit. And that's part of the intentional ambiguity of an optical illusion like this. In real life, one hopes you can spot a real duck and a real rabbit and know which is which. But an optical illusion like this reminds us of something that our brains do all the time. We see something, our eyes take something in, and then our brain goes into overdrive and overinterprets or adds the data and draws a conclusion about that's definitely what that is definitely a rabbit, that is definitely a duck, and won't allow any other data in that would complicate or confuse that. Your brain actually sort of filters out. Once you've decided that's a duck, your brain will filter out any of the data that might suggest rabbit. Once you've decided that's a rabbit, your brain will say, "Nope, I'm only going to pay attention to details that reinforce what I already have decided I see is here in front of me." It's the way a lot of optical illusions work, and it turns out it's the way a lot of our theological illusions work as well. And the difficult thing to admit is that we don't just do this when it's a harmless drawing. Could it be a rabbit? Could it be a duck? Oh, it turns out it's both. We have a way of doing this with God and with our assumptions about how God operates. And once we see like one or two little points of data, we have a way, let's be honest, we have a way of drawing our own conclusions and refusing to see anything else that doesn't fit inside the conclusions we've already drawn. We keep doing this to God, and Jesus keeps messing with our mental pictures and showing us a more expansive picture of who God is, a different perspective on what God's up to in the world, and changing the way we see, not just with our eyes, but with our spirits and our hearts as well. That's really at the heart of this story that begins chapter 9 in John's Gospel. It's this long story, like 40 verses long. We'll get to hear the whole story and all of its ins and outs this coming Sunday. But it's a story about learning to see, or Jesus bringing sight, and how that sight comes in a couple of different ways. John, the clever storyteller that he is, uses an actual story of somebody who's been born blind as a sort of a launching point for looking at the ways the eyes of our faith sometimes get locked and can only see what we've decided in advance we want to see, rather than letting God surprise us. So the story begins with this famous controversy with the disciples. Jesus is just minding his own business, walking along, and his disciples happen to notice that there's a man there as they're walking past in this town who's been born blind, right? And Jesus' disciples say to him, "Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" So did he sin in the womb before he was born, that he was punished by being born blind? Or did he somehow, God know he was going to sin and punish him in advance? Did his parents sin that he's now born blind as a punishment? They have decided the fact of this man's disability, the fact that he can't see, must be punishment from God, and they refuse any other data that could change their picture. They're convinced somebody sinned. It's either this man or his parents. Which one is the right answer? Who sinned? This is definitely a picture of somebody getting punished for their sin. And we're back to rabbit or duck mode, right? And Jesus answered to them, goes, no, that's not how it works. You all have decided in advance what you think you're looking at, so all you can see is that this must be punishment. That's not how God works. You think the way to spot God in a situation, the way to see or recognize God, is zapping people, either for their sins or their parents' sins. That's not where you'll see God here. You'll see God in the healing of this person's sickness and the healing of this person's malady. And Jesus then proceeds to restore this man's sight so that he can see for the first time in his life. It's amazing, and it's this wonderful moment, not just for the man to be healed, but also for Jesus' disciples in that instant to realize how much they had decided in advance what they would or wouldn't see about how God operates in the world. If you are determined, if you are convinced in advance, if you have already assumed that God is in the business of zapping people, punishing people for sins, and that when bad things happen, that must be God zapping them, that's all you're going to spot. On the other hand, if you are open to the idea that when bad things happen, that's not God zapping somebody, but in fact, you might see God more clearly in the healing of maladies, in the mending of what's broken, in the restoring of what's been lost, in the lifting up of people who've been treated like they don't matter. Now all of a sudden you see a wider picture of where God is in the world. And the whole rest of the story now expands to include the respectable religious people who, again, are convinced they know how God operates in the world. And there's all sorts of twists and turns in the story. They're upset because Jesus has healed this man on the Sabbath day when there's not supposed to be any work done. So they're convinced he can't be from God. He broke the rules. They're convinced that the man who was born blind is a faker or a liar, or that he's a sinner. And at the end of the story, the thing that we keep coming back to is Jesus' insistence on helping us to see more clearly, not just with our eyes, but every time we do this to God, every time we sort of get locked in, this is how God is, it can't be any other way, Jesus goes, wait a second, what about this data? And expands our vision of who God is. It is so easy in this life to assume that God is primarily some bearded, angry fellow up in the sky sending lightning bolts and zapping people. And if that's what you got one or two data points for, you're going to sort of build the whole picture around that. When Jesus instead says that's not what God is like in the world, and that Jesus has come as the lens who helps us to see God more clearly. That's really, in the end, what this is all about. It's the gospel's job, in particular John, the gospel writer's job, is helping us to see that what Jesus is like, God is like. You want to see what God is like in the world, take a look at the humanity of Jesus. So the way Jesus stops and treats this man born blind like a human being rather than just somebody's object lesson, the way he's willing to get his fingers dirty, making mud with his own spit in the soil, in the ground, this is God's willingness to get dirt under the divine fingernails. This is God's willingness to get in close. This is God's insistence that his blindness isn't a punishment. It's not something to be lamented. Yes, he gets his sight in the end, but this isn't a punishment for sin. That's not how it works. In a culture like ours and in a time like ours, every time there's some disaster that happens, every time there's a malady or a hurricane or an earthquake, there's going to be a handful of respectable religious voices quick to point fingers at, well, it was their wickedness, it was their immorality, God was judging them for, and they will generate a list of reasons why this must be God's punishment, because they've already decided that's how God operates in the world, and they will only connect the dots that are convenient to reinforce that picture. Jesus has come to show us a different picture, that in the end, you want to know what God's like. Ultimately, God looks like the love that goes to a cross. God looks like the love that heals even if it's against the rules. God looks like the love that breaks out of a tomb on Easter Sunday. If you've ever been told by somebody else that the hardship you're going through is God's punishment on you for something you've done, or God's judgment because of something you've done, or somebody else's rottenness or sin or whatever, you got Jesus here as a voice in your corner saying that's not how it works. And that Jesus doesn't even give up on those people who are so convinced they know how it is, that Jesus doesn't give up on them. He has come as the one to help us to see more clearly, whether it's the respectable religious people or even Jesus' own disciples who have already pre-decided what they think they see in front of them. Today and every day, Jesus keeps showing up to help us to see more clearly again who he is and where God is in the world and what things we don't get to blame God for. if that's a conversation you want to have, if you want to be a part of that exercise of letting Jesus heal our spiritual vision, and maybe to see things that have been staring us there in the face all along, but that we had already told ourselves we weren't going to see because we saw it a different way. If that's a conversation you're ready for, join us this Sunday as we take a look at this whole story from John chapter 9 and let Jesus do work on the eyes of our hearts. See you Sunday.